40 years ago, 44 years ago actually, on this date, I was in the jungles of Vietnam. That was the conflict of the day. Remember, we had a draft back in those days. And I found myself surrounded with a lot of kids that were drafted, many of them out of the inner cities, kids that hadn't finished school, kids that had issues. I thought it would be the worst year of my life, and actually it turned out to be a pivotal year. It was in that environment that I felt a sense of calling to work with troubled young men. So when I got out of the military, left my business career, and started a program with the juvenile court in Atlanta to work with young men on probation. Did not take very long before I realized that you can't work very effectively with troubled young men apart from their family situations. Went back to school to learn how to work with families and increased our organization, our program, to include entire families. But eventually it became apparent that you can't work very effectively with struggling families apart from the environment that impacts on them every time they step out of the door. Which pushed me to get more involved with what was going on in the street, with the police, in the schools. And eventually it became clear to me that if you're going to change an environment, the very best way to do it is to work from within, to become a part of that environment and to work for change from the inside. That is not an insight that one shares readily with one's spouse. Matter of fact, we were just building Peggy's new dream house, a little farther out of the city. And I waited way too long to reveal this new sense of insight, new calling. Actually, we were about 5 weeks away from moving into our new house. And I remember the night that it happened. We'd gone to bed early, and Peggy just wanted to talk. That's when you're picking out the carpet and the light fixtures and the cabinetry. This is high energy time. She just wanted to talk. I said, I don't think you want to talk to me tonight. And she said, really, what's wrong? And that's when I came out with it. I said, I don't think God wants us moving farther out of the city. I think he wants us moving into the city. That was a bad night. In the morning, Peggy said, is this your idea or God's idea? Because if it's your idea, I don't want to have anything to do with it. And she said I wanted it in writing, which I wrote out a 7-page letter describing as best I could what I sensed was a calling. And she took that around to her girlfriends and our small group leader and our pastors, and eventually concluded that at least I believed that this was a calling. And if it is, what choice do you really have? It's a tribute to Peggy's spiritual depth, that she let go of her vision to raise our 2 boys in a new home, in a healthy environment, good schools, good friends, the kind of environment that she had grown up in. Let go of that to move into the heart of a high-crime neighborhood that seemed like a very strange and very dangerous place to raise children. Well, that move changed everything. That was about a 10-year learning curve for me. During that 10 years, I was commuting into the city and working with families, working in a particular inner city community. We'd gotten hold of an old Presbyterian church there that had closed, and I set up my office there, and we started a variety of programs that good churches, good agencies do, the clothes closet, the food pantry, those things. The one that created most excitement was what we called our Adopt a Family program at Christmas time. That's when we would give the names of kids that were not going to get anything for Christmas to caring folks from around the city who would go shopping, and on Christmas Eve would deliver gifts to the homes of those children. And it created a lot of excitement. But the first year that we were in the neighborhood, that was really the first time I had time to be in the homes of some of the recipient families when the gift-bearing families arrived. And I saw something that I had never noticed before. The kids, of course, were all excited. The moms were gracious, maybe a little embarrassed. But if there was a dad in the household, he just disappeared. He was gone out the back door. And it dawned on me what was happening was that these parents in front of their children were being exposed for their inability to provide. And the moms would endure that indignity for the sake of the kids. But it was just more than a father's sense of pride could handle. It was as though his impotence was being exposed in front of his wife and children in his own living room. It was killing him. I'd never seen that before. And it made me wonder, is a similar kind of indignity going on with the other programs that we were doing? I was reading everything I could get my hands on in those days on poverty and urban issues. Frankly, there wasn't a lot of literature. But I came across one book that really struck me. A French philosopher by the name of Jacques Ellul, writing about the city and poverty. And this quote jumped off the page at me. Ellul said, almsgiving, that's the old word for charity, almsgiving is mammon's perversion of giving. It affirms the superiority of the giver. It binds the recipient and demands gratitude. It humiliates him and reduces him to a lower state than he had before. Can you see why that hit me right in the heart? That wasn't why we were there to diminish anybody. We were there to affirm, to encourage, to build up. Certainly not to humiliate. And it made me wonder, are the other programs that we're engaged in doing that same thing, diminishing our neighbors? So I started looking closely at everything we were doing. The clothes closet, that was an easy one to set up. We had plenty of space, and generous people donated clothing. Was really quite easy to set up. And it was a good spirit. We said, these are the free gifts of God's people. Help yourself. It was a beautiful spirit until we actually opened the doors. And then folks came charging in and grabbing up as many armfuls of clothing as they could carry out, and then I would find the clothing scattered around the community, no place to try them on. And I realized this is not good stewardship, and so we hastily drew up some rules. Limit the number of garments per visit, limit the number of visits per month, and posted those rules. And that was like saying, let the games begin. Can I get some garments for my children that are in school? Well, that's reasonable. Can I get some garments for my sick uncle who can't get in here today? You see where it's going. In no time, we're behaving like police, guarding the resources against the very folks we were there to serve among. It became an adversarial relationship almost overnight, not at all what we had in mind. We had in mind sharing our lives and sharing our resources with our neighbors, not ending up being policed to guard against the greed of our neighbors. The food pantry, it was always hard to get that one equitable. We'd have a donation of a couple dozen canned hams. Well, there were 50 people standing in line. How do you distribute that equitably? And some folks would get canned corn, and others would get pickled beets. But as Ellul says, you expect gratitude. And so folks were definitely saying thank you, but you just never knew what was behind those smiles, what was just underneath the surface. It did not lead to genuine relationships. Service projects, well, when you're living in a community of need, there's all kinds of ways to mobilize volunteers. And we just did a lot of that, fixing roofs of seniors in the community, doing handicap ramps, playgrounds, even building houses like Habitat. A lot of volunteer activity. So I was sitting on my porch one day. It was a Saturday morning, and Virgil, my neighbor across the street, was sitting there with me, and a 14-passenger church van came down the street in front of our house, real slow. Kids inside, they were waving. Obviously, they're in the community to do a service project that Saturday. And Virgil said something that really shocked me. He said, "You know, I just hate it when those volunteers come down here." I said, "Really?" I said, I thought you liked volunteers. He said, "Oh, they do good," but he said, they insult you, and they don't even know they're insulting you. He told me about one volunteer lady who came into his house and was just going on and on about how neat and clean his house was. Well, he says, I know she didn't mean any harm, but he said, I know what's behind that she was surprised that a black family living in the inner city wasn't living in a hovel. And another woman he told me about was raving about how smart and well-behaved his children were. He said, I know what's behind that my children seem different from her ideas of what inner city children are like, that they're rowdy and they're ignorant. He said, they just insult you. They don't even know it. Well, I want to tell you, a series of these kind of experiences rocked me. I started looking closely at everything that we were doing. Most of these activities were kind of one-way giving, charitable giving to our neighbors. And I noticed that there was a downward spiral that seemed to repeat itself over and over again. If you give somebody something once, I found, it almost always elicits appreciation. Oh, thank you very much. Surprise, delight. This is wonderful. But if you do it twice, you start to create a little bit of anticipation. Oh, I wonder if this is what he does. I wonder if this is a program that he's starting. By the third time, it becomes an expectation. I know he does this. I need to get in position to get the next handout that's coming because I'm expecting it to come. It's now an expectation. By the fourth time, it's an entitlement. I want a ham this Thanksgiving rather than a turkey, thank you. I have a voice in this. I have a right. You own me. It's an entitlement. By the fifth time, it's just pure dependency. You can't stop now. We're counting on this. We're depending on this. I saw that pattern repeat itself over and over again in the kind of charity we were doing. And I said, we got to stop this. We got to get out of this cycle. And so he made the decision, we're only going to give stuff away, emergency help away, in the time of crisis. Whereupon the incidence of crises skyrocketed. Everybody had a crisis. I said, wait a second. There's got to be, we've got to make a difference here between what is a crisis and what is a function of chronic poverty. We've got to distinguish what the difference is. A crisis demands emergency response. That's when a earthquake hits Haiti. That is a crisis. And so you get in there with airlifts of food and medical supplies and clothing and all of the things that are needed to address an emergency situation. But when the crisis is past, when the emergency supplies have been distributed, now it's time to shift into the rebuilding period. That's a chronic stage, and chronic need requires a development response, helping to rebuild people's lives, people's homes, people's businesses, the schools. Time for rebuilding. If you address a crisis need with a crisis intervention, lives are saved. It's absolutely the right response. On the other hand, if you address a chronic need with a crisis intervention, people are harmed. Let me give you an example of something that I saw last fall when I visited New Orleans. You remember when Katrina hit New Orleans? That was a crisis. And we responded as a nation with all kinds of outpouring of emergency help. It was the right response. That was 10 years ago. You know what's going on in New Orleans still today? There are convoys of caring people from all over the country that drive into New Orleans loaded down with emergency supplies to minister to the victims of Katrina. You get it? Victims of Katrina. Created a whole victim class of people who are dependent for their livelihood on the ongoing outpouring of emergency supplies. That should have stopped within 6 months after Katrina. That should have shifted to development. Remember the old adage? Feed a man a fish, he eats for a day. Teach him to fish, he eats for a lifetime. We should have been teaching folk to fish rather than continue to set up fish feeding stations. So what do? How do we get the toxicity out of systems that are rightly motivated, but are actually harming people as opposed to helping them to develop and to move out of poverty? What do? Well, for one thing, we said we've got to narrow our focus. We can't spread ourselves all over the south side of Atlanta. We'll narrow it down to our particular community. That way we can have more accountable relationships. We get to know our neighbors. It becomes much more personal. And so narrowing our focus from all over the city down to our own neighborhood. And then we said, we've got to change the way we view our neighbors. Instead of seeing our neighbors as people in need, we've got to start seeing them as people with resources, people with abilities, people who are created in God's image and have much to contribute. We've got to remind ourselves daily that no one is so poor in our community that they have nothing to contribute. Everybody has something to contribute. And I believe it becomes the responsibility of those of us who are stewards of resources to find those ways that everybody can participate. And then, fourthly, we said we adopted a golden rule. The golden rule of effective service is we'll never do for others what they have the capacity to do for themselves. When you do for others what they have the capacity to do for themselves, you disempower them. You assume responsibility on yourself that was never your weight to carry. And so, armed with those new guidelines, we set about changing all of our programs. The Adopt a Family for Christmas, that was the second Christmas that we were there in the neighborhood as folks started calling in for their adopted family. I asked them if they would give an extra gift this year. I asked them, would you give the gift of dignity to the dads? And here's how you do it. Go shopping, buy the toys, don't wrap them. Bring them down and we'll set up a storefront We'll call it the old toy shop, and we'll put somewhere between a wholesale and a garage sale price on those toys. And we'll invite parents to come in and go shopping. And even those that are unemployed, we're creating cash flow here. That means we can hire them so that everybody will have resources, will have money to purchase that toy, those toys that they knew would delight their children, so that on Christmas morning, the parents in our community have the same joy as most parents in our city have of seeing their kids open the gifts that they have selected and given through the efforts of their own hand. And there will be dignity in the process of exchange. Well, that's a quantum leap, getting folks to let us sell the gifts that they usually have the joy of giving. But when I explain to them, you know, what a kid needs really more than a toy is an effective parent. And we're going to take the proceeds of the sale of these toys and set up an employment training program for unemployed parents so that this time next year, some of those parents will be working in the marketplace and able to fully support their own families. We call it Pride for Parents. And the extra gift that I asked for, I said, do you know that feeling that you get when you see those kids so excited about receiving the gifts that you bring? You know that feeling? That's what I want you to give to the dads, so that on Christmas morning, they have that rush of excitement in seeing their kids open the gifts that they have gotten. We learned a couple of very important lessons in that first year of Pride for Parents. One, we learned that parents in our community would rather work to earn, to purchase those toys that they knew would delight their children than they would stand in the free toy lines with their proof of poverty to accept gifts that someone else had given for their children. We learned that. We also learned a universal truth. Universal. That means for all people of all time. It's this. Everyone loves to find a bargain. Universal. Absolutely. So Peggy goes out shopping this past Christmas, and it's a grueling day of Christmas shopping. She brings her treasures home, spreads them around the living room for me to admire. And she said, and you know what? I saved more than I spent. I'm not an economist. Don't know exactly how that works economically, but I do know this, that she was excited about finding bargains. So why do we think it would be such a blessing to the poor to set up a system that would deprive them of the joy of finding and purchasing bargains for their own families? Why do we think that would be a blessing? The clothes closet, well, I asked a Methodist men's group who had helped us collect clothes. Do we have any Methodists here today? They're very smart people. They know problems, and they don't even have to be there. They know the solutions. And I was explaining this adversarial relationship. Well, they said there's a simple solution. It's called a market. You put a fair rate of exchange on a desired commodity, it cuts all that out. I said, really? Oh, yeah, they said. I said, can you help us set that up? Well, they had a meeting, and they said, yeah, we'll take this on as our men's project this year. And they did what they can't help doing in their sleep. Anyhow, got to have a business plan. Traffic flow patterns, real estate research. Got to be on a bus line. Shop the competition. Got to bring this in right underneath the Salvation Army thrift store. They said, if we do this right, we can hire folks from the community, train them in retail merchandising, move them out into the economic mainstream. Takes about 2 years, they said, for a small business like this to break even. They were right. 18 months later, it moved into the black economically. Been a bright spot in the community for 25 years. And those guys were absolutely right. The dynamic changed instantly. The dynamic between giver and recipient, where the giver has to guard against the recipient getting too much, and the relationship between merchant and customer, where the merchant needs the customer to purchase all that they can afford to purchase and keep coming back, because that's how he pays the light bill. That's how he meets payroll. And it didn't take very long for our 4 trainees to figure out that their paychecks were also riding on good customers and return customers. And so the question was, how do we keep them coming back? Well, we got to know their names, they said. You can find out something about them. That'll be important. So when Miss Jones comes into the store, I said, "Good morning, Miss Jones. How are you this morning? How's your mother doing?" See, everybody loves to go, everybody knows their name, right? A lot of energy invested in how you make people feel valued, even to the extent of how our store smells. You know, you're dealing with used clothing. Sometimes that can be a little musty smell. Can't afford to dry clean them all. Well, they said, you know, if we had a pot of fresh brewed coffee in the morning that'd help. And one of the trainees said, yeah, we could have some microwave cookies going in the morning. That'd help. That's all about making people feel valued, making people feel welcome. Change the dynamic totally. So I asked Virgil, shall we just cut out these service projects? Is it too hard on folks' sense of dignity? He said, no, they do good. But he said it sure would help if we were the ones here in the community deciding what projects we wanted help with. Write that one down. Community initiated. He said, I'll tell you another thing, it would be a lot better if we were managing and supervising the projects rather than having outsiders come in and tell us what to do. Write that one down. Community led. And so our paradigm changed into one of exchange, where everyone has something of value to contribute, and that no one is so poor that they have nothing to bring to the table. We worked on kind of a code of conduct. The physicians have the Hippocratic Oath, which they've been taking for hundreds of years. Ethical guide for behavior. I thought, wouldn't it be good if we had something similar to that, those of us that are helpers? And so I'll share that with you in closing. The number one rule is I will never do for others what they have the capacity to do for themselves. When I do that, I assume responsibility and weaken people. I disempower them. Number two, I'll limit my one-way giving to actual crises, but I'll seek always to find ways of legitimate exchange. Number three, I'll empower by hiring, lending, and investing. Hiring, that's an honorable transaction. That's a fair wage for a job well done. Lending brings accountability into the formula. Somebody's going to pay me back. When Diane comes to my door and needs $20 till the weekend, I give it to her without thinking much about it, because Diane always pays back. But when Ethel comes to my door and asks for $20, I say, not until you pay me back the last $20 that you said you'd pay. There's accountability there. It's what lending does. In investing, That's when I take an ownership stake in our business. That's when I get very vested. That's your Shark Tank involvement, where I think your idea is good enough to invest my own money, and now I'm interested in helping to make that business succeed. Hiring, lending, and investing, but gifts, very sparingly, and as incentives to achievement. 4, I'll put the interests of those I serve above my own self-interest or that of my organization, even when it means changing my agenda. I'll listen carefully for the spoken and unspoken needs, knowing that many clues may be hidden. There was a group recently that came back from Haiti. They were telling me that coming through this little village, they saw women with infants in their arms wrapped in newspaper and dirty rags, and it broke their hearts. They went into the city and bought up a bunch of baby blankets and brought them back and distributed to those women so they would have something warm and clean and soft for their babies. The next day when they came through the village, they saw those blankets in the shops along the street. Those women had sold those blankets. And the volunteers were incensed until the staff person on the ground said they sold them for food for their babies. The real need is food. Well, how do you know that? How do you know that unless you hang around long enough to build relationships, to hear the hearts of people? You know how long it took for Virgil to give me honest feedback on the way we were doing our volunteer involvement? 5 years. 5 years of being neighbors before he had enough courage to take the risk of confronting me. And then, last of all, this is the same as the Hippocratic Oath, the last point of the Hippocratic Oath. Above all, to the best of my ability, I'll do no harm. Amen? Amen. We've got 10 minutes left for a little Q&A. I can't imagine you wanting to challenge any of this. But you go ahead and voice your opposition, and then I'll explain how you're wrong.
Hi, my name's Chris from Rochester, New York.
Chris.
Just a question about working with organizations that are already in the community doing the kind of work that you're saying is not what we want to be doing.
You're talking about toxic kind of stuff.
Yeah, and these are, people we love and want to partner with and support their work. They're like, settlement houses that have been in the neighborhood for 100 years that used to teach immigrants how to sew, and now they're doing different work in the neighborhood, but they're running these Christmas basket programs, and we're trying to be good neighbors to them as institutions and nonprofits, and when they see us engaged in this kind of work, they get on their heels like, whoa, our livelihood depends on, this program, and so many people need it. And so maybe you could give us some feedback on how to work with, really invested
Existing
institutions.
Programs, right? Yeah, good question. It always comes up, whether it's in the community or churches that have been doing this for a long time. And first of all, it's all rightly motivated. These are good people with very good hearts. And they need to be affirmed. A frontal assault would probably not be wise, to tell them that what they're doing is hurting people. I wouldn't do that. What I think is the most effective strategy is to create alongside those programs a different model, a better way of doing it. So for example, our food pantry. Well, we decided that a food co-op would be a whole lot better idea than that, where folks, kind of like a buying club. Well, that took off, and folks were excited about that and expanded their their buying power of their grocery dollar significantly, and they just didn't use the food pantry much anymore. We never had to close it down. It just there was a better way. It was a better model, and so I think our strongest approach for changing toxic systems is to provide working models of programs that actually do develop people, as opposed to create increasing dependencies. My short answer, yes.
Okay, thank you so much for the discussion today. I think the question I have is around level playing fields. So, for example, if I look at this list and if I think about what my parents would say, they would agree with all of these things, but by the same token, they decided to pay for my education. They decided to bail me out when I needed help. And so, I look at it and it's so funny because I can hold all these things as beliefs, and yet when it comes to my own, I'm going to look past some of these so that I can make a big impact on them. And I guess my question, I have a student who also believes all of these things, and I think the impact on her has been very devastating because she spent so much of her mental energy trying to convince her own kids that she can pull herself up by her bootstraps, that she hasn't had time to focus on becoming having the stability to become the type of mom that can spend time with her kids. And so I guess my question to you is around, if someone comes in, my student, for example, is an orphan. She doesn't have a mom to invest in her education. She doesn't have a mother to invest in her own education. And I guess my question is, do these rules apply when the person coming in has had an extraordinarily unlevel playing field to start with, given that my parents, as wealthier parents, could always bail me out by paying for my education, and I didn't have to give that back to them. So I guess my question is like, I agree in principle with everything you say, but how is it fair to give in this way to people who are poor, but to allow parents to give it a different level to their own kids?
I think what you're pointing out, rightly so, is that people are different at very different stages in life, different stages of need and resource. And so I think that one size fits all may not be the answer. And so I think these are principles. And to the extent we can weave them into the way we do services, I think it moves it in a more developmental direction. But I also think we've got to be wise enough to be sensitive to where people are. And so I agree with you. It's radical change might be hurtful to folks. So perhaps we do it over time. Yes.
Thank you so much for this conversation. My name is Susan Neufeld, and I'm with Bridge Housing. And I have a two-part question. We are practicing incentives at one of our developments, a financial incentive. It's a grocery gift card when people participate in a critical threshold of activities. And frankly, have had lots of struggles among the staff and debates about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing or somewhere in the middle. So I'm curious to know what your perception or perspective is on that. And then the second part is, how do you do change management when you've created an expectation or a certain culture around assistance and then change the game?
Well, fortunately, we were in a position where our organization was small enough so that we could implement changes. We could do that rather quickly. In a large organization, I think that's more difficult. And for example, if you're in a large church that is engaged in a lot of giveaway programs, that's probably a much slower process. Creating within that institution models of development. The first part of your question was what? Remind me that again.
Incentives. And
right.
Change management is also about how do you change expectations of those who are receiving.
Yeah, for the most part, I think those kinds of giveaway incentives kind of represent a false economy. And we do that with kids in our program. We, for certain behaviors that we want to see them demonstrate in schoolwork and home studies and that sort of thing, we pay them in what we call MITS bucks, M-I-T-S, Moving in the Spirit. It's a performing arts program. And they accumulate MITS bucks in a checkbook, and so essentially they're building up savings over the year, which they can then cash in at our toy store at Christmas time to purchase toys and other things for their siblings and for their parents. So it's a teaching tool, but it's also a reward for certain behaviors that we want to encourage. So I think incentives are good, but to the extent that we have to bribe people to come to our programs, I'm wondering if those programs are valued enough by the people that come. Budgeting is one of those things that we've just never had good results with. So, question is, if it's not of significance or value to the recipient, I'm not sure how an additional incentive is a very positive thing. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. My question has actually been answered. I know I asked in some form, but I'm going to try, because what I'm hearing from you makes sense. I think lots of sense, but I'm rubbing my head trying to figure out how realistic is it really for me in the community I come from. And I'm from Cleveland. We have a system that has 19 council people, and they get CDBG money every year that they allocate, especially during the holidays. Each one of them makes an allocation to purchase grocery gift cards that is given out to residents. I will venture to say that it is politically motivated, because those people that get those cards remember who they got it from, and when the time comes, they try to vote for that person. And so as I listen to you and think about the implications of what you've said and how it could really work differently, the fact that in my one neighborhood where I serve, there are still 18 other neighborhoods that will be doing the same thing because I don't represent them. So in your mind, how could such a change that you are advocating be possible?
Well, it sounds like you're describing a way for politicians to buy votes. Would that be accurate?
Well, it is an eligible CDBG expenditure. So they're not doing anything wrong. It's allowed by law.
Yeah. Well, I much prefer a market approach than a political approach. So, for example, one of the best models I know of addressing the food issue is a young guy in Florida who has created what he calls Harvest Food and Community Outreach, and it's a store, a grocery store, that signed up members, qualified financially, can buy their groceries at 30 cents on the dollar. Huge bargain. Wow. And that 30 cents pays for overhead and also a whole range of services that their members then use to take measured steps to move out of poverty. it addresses the food insecurity need, and it uses their resources in a variety of programs that help them move toward greater measures of self-sufficiency. I think to spend our energy on programs that actually develop folk, that are developmental, I think is the right expenditure of our energy and our creativity. Political favoritism, that's always going to be there. The giveaway programs, they're going to be there. But, you know, there is a reason why the poor stay poor. There's a reason. And it's largely because of the systems that of those controlling resources. It's largely because those systems do not develop, but they reinforce dependency. So I think if we are really concerned about the poor moving out of poverty, we've got to put our energies into those programs, those initiatives that actually teach folk to fish. But other than that, I don't have any opinion on it. We are out of time, so you got the last question here, and we'll make it real brief.
Okay. Is Virgil on your board?
No.
And why not?
Well, I don't know. Well, let me put it this way. He's not on our organization's board. He's on our community board.
But don't you think organizations would be stronger if they had voices like Virgil's on the board making the decisions?
Oh, we do have residents on our board, yeah.
Okay.
Virgil just didn't want them. Virgil's very active in the neighborhood association, though, the neighborhood board. But your point is well made, and it's a good one to end up on. Thank you.